In the early 1970s, the United States was still struggling with the scars of the Vietnam War, the cultural upheavals of the 1960s, and a growing distrust in political institutions. It was a tense and uncertain time when faith in government had begun to fray, yet few Americans could imagine that the greatest political scandal in modern U.S. history was about to unfold. The story began quietly, almost invisibly, in the early hours of June 17, 1972. 5 men wearing business suits and latex gloves crept into the Democratic National Committee headquarters located in the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. They carried cameras, lockpicks, and electronic equipment. Their mission was to plant listening devices and photograph sensitive campaign documents. It was not the first time they had entered the building. The burglars were part of a larger operation directed by members of President Richard Nixon's re-election committee, known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, often mockingly called CREEP. The men were caught almost immediately. Security guard Frank Wills noticed tape covering a door latch and alerted the police. The burglars, James McCord, Bernard Barker, Frank Sturgis, Virgilio Gonzalez, and Eugenio Martinez, were arrested inside the office suite. They carried large sums of cash linked to bank accounts connected with Nixon's campaign. At first, the incident seemed minor, dismissed by most newspapers as a simple burglary. But 2 young reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, sensed something larger behind the break-in. They began a relentless investigation that would eventually unravel the entire conspiracy. Meanwhile, inside the White House, President Nixon and his closest advisors were deeply concerned about the potential fallout. Nixon himself had not ordered the break-in, but he quickly became involved in efforts to cover it up. He feared that the scandal could destroy his presidency and his chance for re-election. The men arrested had ties to his administration, especially to a secretive group known as the Plumbers, whose original purpose had been to stop leaks of classified information, particularly the Pentagon Papers, a set of documents exposing government deception in Vietnam. The Plumbers had morphed into a covert operations team willing to conduct illegal acts in the name of national security and political advantage. At the same time, the public knew very little. Nixon's re-election campaign went on with enormous success. In November 1972, he won a landslide victory over Democratic candidate George McGovern, securing 49 of 50 states. The American people overwhelmingly endorsed his leadership, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Yet behind the scenes, the FBI was quietly investigating the Watergate break-in. The investigation began to reveal that the burglary had not been an isolated incident. It was connected to a broader pattern of political espionage, sabotage, and dirty try. The year 1974 opened with tension and uncertainty. The Watergate scandal was no longer a mere political story, it had become a national obsession. Every newspaper, every television broadcast, and every late-night conversation in America revolved around one question: what did the president know, and when did he know it? The pressure on Richard Nixon intensified as the investigations deepened, and the once confident and commanding leader now seemed trapped in a web of his own making. Inside the White House, morale was collapsing. Aides came and went, resigning or being fired as indictments drew closer. The walls of power that had once protected Nixon were crumbling one by one. Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski pushed relentlessly for access to the secret Oval Office tapes. He knew that those recordings held the truth, the raw, unfiltered conversations that could prove whether Nixon had conspired to obstruct justice. Nixon, however, continued to resist. He claimed that executive privilege gave him the right to keep those tapes private, arguing that releasing them would damage the presidency itself. But the country had grown tired of excuses. The courts and Congress wanted the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Meanwhile, public patience was running out. Polls showed that a majority of Americans believed the president had lied. Yet Nixon continued to assert his innocence, appearing on national television to declare, "I am not a crook." The words, meant to restore trust, only deepened the sense of crisis. To many, it sounded desperate, a hollow defense from a man surrounded by scandal. The moral authority of the presidency, once seen as sacred, was now being questioned in homes and classrooms across the nation. In the Senate and House of Representatives, investigations pressed forward. The Senate Watergate Committee continued to uncover documents, memos, and testimony showing how deeply the administration had been involved in illegal activities. The House Judiciary Committee began quietly preparing for the possibility of impeachment, though few yet dared to believe that a sitting president might actually be removed from office. The courts were now a central battlefield. The legal clash between Nixon and Jaworski reached the Supreme Court in the summer of 1974. The case, United States versus Nixon, became one of the most important constitutional tests in American history. Could the President of the United States claim absolute privilege to withhold evidence in a criminal case? The answer would determine not just Nixon's fate, but the balance of power between the executive branch and the rule of law itself. As lawyers argued before the justices, the country held its breath. Nixon's own legal team argued that releasing the tapes would violate the separation of powers and weaken the presidency forever. The special prosecutor countered that no one, not even the president, is above the law. On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court delivered its unanimous. After the resignation, the shock of Watergate still rippled through every corner of America. The country found itself staring into an uncomfortable mirror, forced to confront what the scandal had revealed about its leaders, its institutions, and even its people. The image of the presidency had always been cloaked in dignity, an untouchable symbol of unity and moral authority. But after Watergate, that illusion was shattered. The office remained, the flag still flew, but the faith of the people had been wounded in ways that could not easily be healed. In the months following Nixon's departure, a quiet unease settled over Washington. Reporters who had once hunted every lead now looked for what would come next. Congressional committees continued to issue reports, and the word "reform" became the new political slogan. The public demanded changes that would ensure no future president could abuse power as Nixon had done. And so began a wave of legislation meant to restore transparency and accountability to government. Congress passed the Ethics in Government Act, requiring public officials to disclose financial information and avoid conflicts of interest. The War Powers Act was enacted, limiting the president's ability to engage in military action without congressional approval. The Freedom of Information Act was strengthened, allowing citizens and journalists greater access to government records. The spirit of these reforms was clear: never again would one man or one administration be allowed to operate in the shadows. Yet beyond laws and policies, there was something more profound happening in the American psyche. Watergate had not only exposed corruption, it had eroded a kind of innocence. People began to question not only politicians but the very institutions that had once commanded trust. The idea that leaders might lie, that the government might manipulate truth, became an accepted reality. For generations raised on faith in the system, it was a bitter awakening. The press, which had played such a vital role in uncovering the scandal, emerged with newfound power and responsibility. Journalists like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein became symbols of fearless reporting, their investigation for the Washington Post celebrated as the triumph of truth over power. Newsrooms across the country were inspired to dig deeper, to question more, to believe that journalism could change the world. The media became the watchdog of democracy, and for a time, Americans viewed the press as a guardian of integrity. But even that relationship grew complicated. As years passed, the line between investigation and sensationalism blurred. The legacy of Watergate made journalists more aggressive, sometimes to the point of hostility. Every whisper of scandal, every political misstep, was pursued with the ferocity of a new Watergate. The result was both good and bad: the powerful were held to account, but the constant search for wrongdoing also deepened public cynicism.